In a world that often demands justice, sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is mercy. Explore the complex stories of forgiveness and the incredible strength it takes to let go of the past. Subscribe now to experience these deeply moving human dramas.
I didn't scream. I didn't shake. I just stood there in my own kitchen, holding a dish towel, and watched my son walk out the door like he hadn't just done what he did. That was the moment I knew something in me had shifted. Something old and patient and tired had finally cracked. Not broken, cracked. The way wood splits right down the grain when it's been under pressure for too long. My name is Millicent, and I am 63 years old. I spent 40 of those years building something. A house, a business, a family. I buried my husband Dwight 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. And when he was gone, I did not fall apart. I raised my son alone. I kept the dry cleaning business we'd built together on Pemberton Avenue. I showed up. Every single day, I showed. And my son. I will call him my son because that is what he is. That is what I made him. My son saw all of that and decided it was his. Not something to be proud of. Not something to protect. Something to take from. His wife's name is Rochelle. She came into our lives 6 years ago, and I want to be honest with you. I tried. I brought food to their apartment the first Thanksgiving they were together. I paid for the rehearsal dinner when they got married. I sat in the front pew at that church in Decatur, and I cried the good kind of tears, because I believed my son had found someone who would steady him. He always needed steadying, even as a boy. Too much energy going in the wrong direction. His father used to say, "Millie, that boy just needs a channel. Give him a channel and he'll move mountains." Dwight was an optimist. What my son found in Rochelle was not a steadying force. What he found was a mirror that showed him only the version of himself he wanted to see, the version that deserved things, the version that had been held back, the version that was owed. It started small. It always starts small. He borrowed $12,000 18 months after the wedding. His words, borrowed. He needed it for a down payment on a commercial kitchen space. He and Rochelle had a catering idea. They'd done their research. The timing was right. I asked to see the business plan. He said they were still finalizing it. I gave him the money anyway because he was my son, and Dwight wasn't there to talk sense into either of us. The commercial kitchen never materialized. When I asked about it 8 months later, he told me the market had shifted. Then he asked for $9,000 more, this time for a car. Rochelle's car needed replacing. I said I wasn't sure I could do $9,000 right now, and he looked at me across my own dining room table with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Flat, cold. Like I was an inconvenience he was calculating the cost of. I gave him $6,000. After that, it became routine. Every few months, a need. And alongside the need, a slow and steady repositioning of who I was in his life. I went from being his mother to being a resource. I went from being the person he called when something good happened to being the person he called when he needed something managed. Rochelle stopped coming to Sunday dinners. When I asked why, my son said she found the drive tiring. They lived 22 minutes away. I started sleeping poorly around that time. Not insomnia exactly. More like I would wake at 3 in the morning with a weight on my chest and lie there in the dark listing all the ways I had failed to see things clearly. Then came February. My son called on a Tuesday evening and asked if he and Rochelle could come by Saturday morning. He had something he wanted to discuss. I said of course. I cleaned the house. I made a coffee cake from scratch because that was his favorite when he was small. The kind with the cinnamon crumble on top. I set out the good mugs. They arrived 45 minutes late. Rochelle did not comment on the coffee cake. She sat down at my kitchen table, crossed her legs, and opened her phone. My son sat across from me and told me, in a voice that was practiced and almost gentle, that they needed me to sign over the deed to the building on Pemberton Avenue. The dry cleaning business. The one his father and I had mortgaged our first house to open. The one I had run alone for 11 years. The one that had paid for my son's college tuition, his first car, his wedding, and somewhere north of $40,000 in what he called loans. He said they wanted to expand, turn it into a multi-unit retail space. They had investors lined up, but the building needed to be in both their names to secure the financing. I asked if the investors knew the building was currently mine. He said that was a technicality. I looked at my son. I looked at this man who had come out of my body, who I had rocked through fevers and driven to every baseball practice and held in a hospital parking lot when his father was dying. I looked at him and I thought, who taught you this? I told him I needed time to think. Rochelle looked up from her phone for the first time. She said, And I will not forget this, she said. How much time does she really need? It's not a complicated decision, she said. Sitting in my kitchen, eating none of my coffee cake, she referred to me in the third person like I was not in the room. My son did not correct her. I stood up. I told them I'd be in touch. They left, and Rochelle walked out without her purse. Left it right there on my chair. And my son had to come back to the door for it. And when I handed it to him, I looked him in the eye, and he looked away first. That night, I called my friend Augustina. We have been friends since 1987. We met in a LeMays class, and she is the most practical woman I have ever known in my life. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is rare for her, and when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Millicent, what does your attorney say?" I didn't have an attorney. She gave me a name. His name was Mr. Beaufort, a real estate and estate attorney her church had used for 15 years. I called him Monday morning. I brought every document I had, the deed, the original mortgage papers, every bank transfer I had made to my son over the past 6 years with the word loan written in the memo line, because I am a bookkeeper's daughter and I write everything down. Mr. Beaufort reviewed everything and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Mrs. Millicent, you have been very generous and you have been very careful. Both of those things are going to matter." He explained my rights in language I could follow. The building was mine, solely and completely. No loan my son had taken from me had been secured against it. I had made a will 3 years prior that left the business to my son contingent on his maintaining operations for a minimum of 5 years. A clause my original attorney had suggested and I had agreed to without fully understanding how important it would become. Mr. Beaufort said, "You don't have to give him anything." I had not cried since the Saturday they came over. I cried then, not out of sadness, out of something else. Relief, maybe. Or the particular grief of realizing you already knew something and just needed someone to confirm it. I drove home and I sat in my driveway for a long time. Then I went inside and I made a list. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, my son called to ask if I had made a decision. His voice was lighter than it had been in months, almost cheerful. I think he thought the waiting meant I was coming around. I told him yes, I had made a decision. I said I'd like him to come in person because I wanted to talk through the details. He said Rochelle would come too. I said that was fine. I also called Mr. Beaufort that morning and asked him to be available by phone. They arrived on time, which was unusual. I had made coffee. I had not made coffee cake. I sat down across from both of them and I put a folder on the table. Inside the folder were 2 things. A letter from Mr. Beaufort outlining the full accounting of funds I had transferred to my son since the wedding, $43,200, and a repayment agreement prepared legally, giving him 36 months to return the money with modest interest. The second document was a letter I had written myself, which Mr. Beaufort had reviewed. It stated that I would not be transferring the deed to the Pemberton Avenue property, that I was instead restructuring the business to add an operations manager, Augustina's nephew, who had run a dry cleaning chain in Charlotte, and that I would be reviewing my estate documents to reflect the current state of my relationship with my son. I slid the folder across the table. Rochelle picked it up before he did. I watched her read it. I watched her face change, and then I watched her look at my son with an expression I recognized, the look of someone recalculating. My son looked at me. He said, "Mom, what is this?" I said, "It's a decision. You asked me to make one." He said I was being unreasonable. He said I was punishing him for being entrepreneurial. He said, and here is where something in the room changed permanently. He said that Rochelle had always told him I never really supported him, that I only helped him to hold it over him, and that this proved it. I said, "I gave you $43,000. He said money wasn't support. Rochelle said nothing. She was still looking at the folder. I stood up. I told my son that I loved him, and that I hoped, in time, he would understand this. I said I was not going to argue in my own kitchen. I said I was going to ask them to leave. My son stood up fast, too fast. His chair scraped the floor hard. He pointed at me across the table, actually pointed like I was something he was accusing, and he said things I am not going to repeat here. He said them loudly. He said them in a voice I had never heard from him before, a voice I didn't know he had. And then, "I need you to understand that I am a 63-year-old woman who has never raised her hand to another person in her adult life, who has never had the police at her home, who still sends birthday cards by mail." And then my son leaned across that table and he slapped me. Once. Open-handed, across my left cheek. The sound of it was loud in the kitchen. Louder than I expected. Like something snapping. Rochelle made a sound. not a protest. Something between a gasp and a laugh quickly swallowed. My son stood there. I think even he didn't believe what he had just done. I did not touch my face. I looked at him. I kept my eyes on his eyes. I said, very quietly, "You need to leave my house right now." He left. Rochelle followed him. Neither of them said another word. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The coffee was still hot. There was a red mark on my cheek that I could feel but not see. I picked up the folder from the table. They had left it, and I put it back in the cabinet where I kept important documents. Then I called Mr. Beaufort. "Here is what I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think people expect it to be simple. They expect that once you draw the line, the story becomes clean. It wasn't clean. There were phone calls. Not from my son at first. From his aunt on his father's side. From a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years. From people who had heard some version of events and wanted to weigh in. There was a voicemail from Rochelle telling me I had made my son into the villain, when really I was the one who had always made him feel small. I did not respond to any of it. What I did was work. I went to Pemberton Avenue every morning and I opened the business and I ran it the way Dwight and I had always run it. On reputation, on consistency, on knowing the names of the people who brought their clothes in. I started training Augustina's nephew, whose name was Clifford. No, wait, I should say his name was Perry, young man, 26 years old. Quick with numbers and gentler with customers than you'd expect. He called me Miss Millicent from the first day and never stopped. I also met with the detective. I want to be clear about this part because it matters. When I reported what my son had done to the police, and I did report it the same evening it happened, because Mr. Beaufort told me to, and because I knew if I didn't do it that night, I would talk myself out of it by morning. When I reported it, I was assigned a detective named Garvey, a woman probably 10 years younger than me, who listened to everything I said and wrote it down without any expression on her face at all. When I was done, she said, "Is there anything else you want to add?" I said, "Yes, I want to add that I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this because I should have done something the first time he took money that wasn't his." She looked up from her notepad. She said, "There was a first time?" I said yes. She wrote that down too. My son was charged with simple battery. His attorney, hired with what money I do not know, tried to frame it as a family dispute. The prosecutor disagreed. At the hearing, Rochelle sat in the back of the courtroom. She did not look at me. My son pled no contest and received 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, and a no-contact order that covered me and the property on Pemberton Avenue. The repayment agreement went into civil court. We settled. He agreed to repay $30,000 over 4 years. Whether he will follow through, I honestly do not know. What I do know is this. The building on Pemberton Avenue is still mine. The business is operating better than it was 2 years ago because Perry has a talent for this work and because I am not, anymore, distracted by managing my son's crises. I have updated my will. I have had 3 long, difficult phone calls with my son since the no-contact order was lifted, and in the last one 2 months ago, he said something that almost sounded like an apology. Not quite, but close enough that I wrote it in my journal. My cheek healed in a week. Some other things are taking longer. But I get up every morning. I go to Pemberton Avenue. I know the names of the people who bring their clothes in. I write everything down. Dwight would not have been surprised by any of this, I think. He would have said, "Millie, you always did know how to wait for the right moment." He would have meant it as a compliment. He usually did. I closed the business last Tuesday at 6 o'clock, the way I do every Tuesday, and I drove home and I sat on my porch, and I watched the light change over the neighbor's oak tree, and I thought about what it means to love someone you cannot save. I am still thinking about it, but I am not waiting anymore.